So today we start the last big unit of this course, which talks all about measures, areas, volumes, surface areas. And so we start with linear measures. So let's tackle 14.1 today. We'll work through this PowerPoint that I have on 14.1 and 14.2, although this video is only going to cover 14.1 because that's plenty for one round. So when we talk about linear measures, and you talk about how you're going to teach somebody linear measure, you're going to start with the question of how do you introduce the idea of measuring something to somebody who has no idea about not only what units to use, but the whole concept of finding a length or finding a distance. So suppose you had a table, right? You're sitting at a desk, you're sitting at a table, dining room, whatever you're at, and you want to find out some information about how long it is. You got no ruler, you've got no concept of inches or centimeters. How would you measure the table? Right? Maybe you would take a piece of paper and measure how many sheets of paper it takes to go across the table. Or you would take your hand and measure how many hands. In fact, there's the answer to my question on the bottom. How do you measure a horse? You measure a horse by hands. I do not have a horse, but I've had students who have had horses, and they've told me this. And I still have no idea exactly where you put your hands to measure the horse. Is it height? Is it width? But that's how you measure a horse. So what kind of units would you use if you're starting in an elementary school? That might be an interesting question to ask to see what kinds of units they might use to measure a table. Now, obviously, if we all have different length hands and we all have different length feet, right, we could actually measure with our feet. We're going to get different measures for the same object, and that's not good. So we're going to need eventually to come to some system where we all use a standard unit of measure, and that's what we have. Now, we've got the English system and the metric system. The English system is the one that we use, right? Miles and yards and inches and feet. The metric system uses things like meters and kilometers and centimeters to measure lengths and distances. Common Core standards start with linear measure in grade 2, with students estimating length in inches, feet, centimeters, meters. The whole estimating process is important too because, and you'll do a little bit of this too, how do you know what is a reasonable measure? Would it be reasonable to measure the length of your table in kilometers? Well, I mean, technically it's possible, but it's going to be a very small number. No, you wouldn't measure the length of your table in kilometers. Would you measure the length of your table in centimeters, meters? Yeah, you might. So what are reasonable distances for measuring objects? All right, this is just basic English system, yards, inches, feet, miles. Some basic things to know: 12 inches in a foot. I'll bet you knew that before you came into this class. 3 feet in a yard. Okay, I bet you knew that too. 5,280 feet in a mile. That's something that you should know. The yards you don't have to worry about because if you know how many feet are in a mile, divided by 3, you'll know how many yards are in a mile. But 5,280 feet in a mile is not a terrible thing to keep in the back of your mind. All right, let's do a couple of conversions. I'm going to try to do them on this PowerPoint here, but I might end up having to switch to another board if I run out of space. All right, convert 6 yards to feet. So you're going to do this with a unit analysis. All right, so I have something in yards. All right, I have 6 yards, and I want to convert that to feet. So I need some conversion that converts yards to feet, and I need it in such a way that I can put the yards on the bottom and the feet on the top. This way, the yards will cancel top and bottom, and I'll have an answer that's in feet. Now, the question is, which way does it go? Well, there's 3 feet in 1 yard, so I'm going to put the 3 up here. I'm going to put the 1 down there. 3 feet in the yard. Now multiply 6 times 3, and I get 18. And my units are feet because you notice that I canceled the yards out. You can think of it this way, too. Yards is a much bigger unit of measure. Feet is a smaller unit of measure. So if you're going to go from yards to feet, you're going to go from something that's a bigger measure to something that's a smaller measure. You're going to need more of them to cover those 6 yards. So if you're covering those 6 yards, like 1, 2, 3, and so forth, and you're covering that same distance in feet, well, here's 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 feet, and then 4 feet, 5 feet, 6 feet, and so forth. You're going to need to carry that out until you've covered all 6 yards. It's going to take 18 feet to do that. So a couple of different ways to look at that. All right, the second one says convert 15 feet to yards. So I'm going to start with my 15 feet, and I want to convert that to yards. Well, I need something that gets rid of the feet. So put feet on the bottom, yards on top. How does it work now? Well, 1 yard is 3 feet. And again, my feet cancel top and bottom. And I'm left with 15 on the top, 3 on the bottom. 15 divided by 3 is 5. And my units are yards. All right, the next one says convert 15 feet to inches. Well, inches is a smaller unit of measure, so I'm going to need more of them. So 15 feet and I want to get rid of feet, so I'm going to put feet on the bottom. And I want inches, so I'll put inches on top. Is there a way to convert inches and feet? Sure there are. There's 12 inches in 1 foot. Okay, so now the feet cancel top and bottom, and I get what? 150 plus 30, 180 inches. And not surprisingly, there's many more inches than there are feet. Sometimes, by the way, we have shortened versions of this. In other words, if you want to write inches, you can write it with 2 tick marks like this. If you want to write feet, you can write it with 1 tick mark like that. All right, part D. If I want to convert 1.5 miles to yards. So 1.5 miles, and I want to convert that into yards. Well, how many yards are there in a mile? 1,760. If I forget that, I could always go back to inches and such. But now my yards are in the wrong spot, right? I want to get rid of the miles. So here, I'll put the miles down on the bottom and the yards on top. So 1,760 yards in 1 mile. Now my miles cancel. So if you do like I did and accidentally put it in the wrong spot, you'll realize it because what you're trying to get rid of will simply not go away. All right, so now I multiply 1760 times 1.5. I get 2,640. 2,640 yards. All right, the next one says convert 1.5 miles to feet. Well, same idea except different conversion, right? 1.5 miles. I want something that gets rid of miles, so I'll put the miles on the bottom, feet on top. 5,280 feet in a mile. Now my miles go away, and then I multiply. All right, so 5,280 times 1.5, and I get 7,920. That is a lot of feet. That's how many feet there are in a mile and a half. All right, last one I'm going to put down here, convert 80 inches to feet. So this does not look like I'm going to come up with a whole number. I've got 80 inches, and I want to convert from inches to feet, so I'm going to put inches on the bottom and feet on top. So 1 foot has 12 inches. Whatever fraction you have over here has to make sense in terms of unit conversion. So 1 foot is worth 12 inches. That's how I know what to put there. So I end up with inches canceling top and bottom. 80 divided by 12 gives me 6.67, or 6 2/3. So you can write it as 6 2/3 feet, or as a decimal, 6.67 feet. All right, so not everything comes out in whole foot measurements, and that's an example. All right, the next slide I basically already did, right? Keeping track of unit conversions. Sometimes, though, they get a little bit more complicated. Like the ones we did, you could do all in one piece. Sometimes you're going to need a little bit more. So suppose you want to convert 55 yards to inches. Well, that one you can do actually in one step, right? 55 yards. And then you know how many inches there are in a yard, right? There's 36 inches in 1 yard, and then just multiply, and you've got your answer. On the other hand, suppose you want to convert 2.5 miles to inches. Well, you may not have an inches to miles conversion memorized. I don't. So I'm going to work it out one piece at a time. So 2.5 miles. The first thing I think of when I think of miles is feet. So I know that in 1 mile, there's 5,280 feet. Okay, well, that gets me somewhere, right? Gets me away from miles and towards feet, but that's still not what the question asks. The question asked me to go all the way down to inches. So now I need another conversion where I can put feet on the bottom and inches on the top. Do I know a conversion between inches and feet? Of course I do. 1 foot is 12 inches, and now you notice the feet cancel top and bottom here, and I'm left with inches as my unit. Right? How many inches? Well, I don't know. Let's take a calculator and multiply. 2.5 times 5,280 times 12, and I get 158,400. All right, so in this case, there's an example of why we would want to measure that distance in miles and not in inches, because it's 158,400 inches to cover 2.5 miles. 2.5 miles is a better unit of measure for whatever we were doing, right? If we're telling somebody to go down the road, you wouldn't tell them go down the road 158,400 inches. You'd say go down 2.5 miles and make your turn. All right, rates. So rates is the same idea. Think of miles per hour. We were kind of already doing that, right? We had a unit on the top and a unit on the bottom. So miles per hour can also be represented like this, miles per hour. So it tells me how many miles I can cover in an hour. So if you're driving 55 miles an hour, that means every hour you're covering 55 miles. Now, suppose I don't want a unit in miles per hour. Suppose I want a unit in feet per second. Well, let's try it. If I'm going 55 miles in 1 hour, and I want an answer in feet per second. So I'm going to have a bunch of stuff to convert here. Well, first of all, maybe I can convert miles to feet. I know that. I can put miles down here, feet up here. We said there were 5,280 feet in a mile. Okay. Well, now the miles go away. What do I know about time? In 1 hour, how many seconds are there? I don't know. But I know in 1 hour, there's 60 minutes. And I know in 1 minute, there's 60 seconds. So maybe I can use that information to get me closer to my answer. Now what cancels? The hour up here and the hour down there goes away. The minute up here and the minute down there goes away. And you notice that the units I'm left with are feet on the top, seconds on the bottom. And the only thing I have left to do now is take all of my numbers and multiply them. Here, let me move this over a little bit. And so we can multiply across the top. 55 times 5,280. Get my answer. Divide it by 3,600, which is 60 times 60. And I get 80.67. And my units then are feet per second. So covering 55 miles in an hour is the same thing as covering roughly 81 feet every second, which is pretty impressive. All right, this last one, when you go out running, you cover 10.25 feet every second. What's your speed in miles per hour? So you know how many feet you cover in a second. You want to know how you're keeping pace with the cars on the road. So 10.25 feet per second means you cover 10.25 feet in 1 second. Now, eventually, I want this to come out in miles per hour. So you think I can convert the seconds to become hours and the other ones to become miles. Now, let's see if this is possible. I know that in 1 minute, I can cover 60 seconds. So 60 seconds is 1 minute. And 60 minutes is 1 hour. So the seconds can go away and the minutes can go away. And now I got an answer in feet per hour, which is not quite what I want. I want it to be in miles per hour. So I need to put some feet on the bottom, and I need to put some miles up on top. Now, you might want to be careful in this problem because you've got both miles and minutes. And if you use MI for miles and MI for minutes, you're going to forget which one is which pretty quickly. So there's 1 mile in 5,280 feet. And now does that work? The feet cancel top and bottom. So I think everything cancels except for these hours over here and miles on the top. And that's what I want, miles per hour. The rest of it is just me taking my calculator and multiplying things out. So if I take 3,600, which is 60 times 60, multiply it by 10.25, and now divide that by 5,280, you're running at about 6.99, almost 7 miles an hour. So here, I'll give you 6.99 miles per hour. So it's roughly 7 miles an hour is the equivalent of covering 10.25 feet every second. All right, so that's the English system. How about the metric system? Let's do a little bit on the metric system, and then we'll come back for part 2 and look at perimeters and stuff like that. So the metric system, sometimes known as SI. Why do they call it SI? It's French. The international system, except the French put the system first and they put the adjective second. So the advantage of using the metric system, that's why it was developed, is because the ratio of one unit to another is always a power of 10. So you don't have to say, well, there's 12 inches in a feet, but wait a minute, there's 36 inches in a yard, but there's 3 feet in a yard. They always go up by powers of 10. Of course, then you got to remember what the conversions are between them. So this chart I found, I don't know where I found it, but it gives you the different types of lengths in metric. Now, the basic unit in metric is a meter, okay? So everything comes from that meter. So if this is sort of the center point of it, then everything that's larger is up here, larger than a meter, and anything smaller than a meter is down here. So if a meter is sort of the basic unit of length, then if you take a tenth of that or a hundredth of that or a thousandth of that, then you end up with the units down the bottom. Now, not all of these are common, right? A centimeter is a hundredth of a meter. So you got 100 meters in a centimeter. You've got 1,000 meters in a millimeter, right? So a millimeter is a thousandth of a meter. We don't use decimeters very often. We don't use micrometers very often or nanometers unless you're doing some sort of, physics, atomic research. Up on the top, certainly we use kilometers, right? A kilometer is 1,000 meters. Hectometers and decameters you don't use all that often, but it is interesting to sort of see those types of meters that we don't use on an everyday basis. So how big are these things? Well, from one shoulder to the end of your index finger on the other arm, that's about a meter. A decimeter, right, that's a tenth of a meter, is about the width of your hand. A centimeter is about the width of your nail. And a millimeter is very, very small, right? If you look at your ruler that's marked off in centimeters, a tenth of a centimeter is a millimeter. That's about the width of a paper clip, like the actual metal piece of the paper clip. So that's a very small measure. So you can start to get an idea of the size of these things in metric. So it says convert each of these measurements to the units shown. So if I want to go from millimeters to meters, there's 1,000 millimeters in a meter. So I could actually just take this and go 1, 2, 3 over and say there's 1.495 meters in 1,495 millimeters, right? The meter is a much bigger measure than the millimeter is, so I'm going to have many fewer meters than I will have millimeters. All right, how about going from centimeters to millimeters? Well, the centimeters to millimeters is only a power of 10, right? There's 100 centimeters in a meter and 1,000 millimeters, so it's only off by a power of 10. I'm going from something larger to something from a larger unit to a smaller unit. So in this case, it actually goes in the other direction. I got to take that 29.5 and move it out there so that I get 295. So there's more millimeters than there are centimeters. Right? If you want to go from meters to kilometers, now you've got to do what? A meter is roughly that, and a kilometer then is 1,000 of them. Okay, so I would have to take this and move it over 1, 2, 3 places, and then put that 0. So I get 0.038741. All right, converting between the two systems, that's the magic conversion. Up at the top, 1 inch is about 2.54 centimeters. So based on this, how many inches in a meter? Well, how many centimeters are there in a meter? I'm trying to find out my answer I want in basically inches per meter, because the question says how many inches are there in a meter? Well, there's 2.54 centimeters in 1 inch. And then, well, if I do it that way, I'm not going to end up with what I want. So let's try this. Let's flip it around and do 1 inch is 2.54 centimeters. And then, how many centimeters are in a meter? There should be 100 centimeters in 1 meter. And you notice that I arranged it one way and then I said, nope, that's not going to work, and I flipped it around. Why did I do that? Well, because I put my answers at the end in inches per meter. So if I'd put the centimeters up on top, I would have ended up with inches on the bottom. And that was already one of the units I wanted. So there was not going to be any conversion between them. So I would have been stuck with inches in the denominator. So I didn't want that. So cross those out. Now the only thing I have to do is take 100 and divide it by 2.54. Right, so 100 divided by 2.54 leaves me 39.37. So there's 39.37 inches in a meter, meaning that a meter is kind of close to a yard, right? Sometimes you have yardsticks and sometimes you have meter sticks. If 1 yard is 36 inches, 1 meter is 39.37 inches. So if you're looking for how do these things sort of compare, in the metric system, a meter is probably close to our yard. So sometimes when you're looking at a yardstick, you're actually looking at a meter stick. So if it goes past 36 inches, if it goes a little bit past 39, then you're looking at a meter stick. So could I go in the other direction? How many inches are there in a meter? I just did that. How many kilometers are there in a mile? Well, if I know that 1 inch is the same thing as 2.54 centimeters, I want an answer in kilometers per mile. So 1 inch is worth 2.54 centimeters. I know that there's 12 inches in a foot. I know that there's 5,280 feet in a mile. And I know that there's, well, I could do this twice, right? I can say that there's 100 centimeters in a meter, and then I can say there's 1,000 meters in a kilometer, and I'm going to come up with the reverse of my answer, and then I'm just going to flip it. All right, so there's 100 centimeters in a meter. There are 1,000 meters in a kilometer. Now, what mess have I created here? I can cross off centimeters and centimeters. I can cross off inches and inches. I can cross off feet and feet. And I can cross off meters and meters and meters. You notice that I'm left with miles on the top and kilometers on the bottom. So let's multiply this out and see what we get. All right, we got 100 times 1,000, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 zeros. Then we're going to divide that by 2.54. We're going to divide that by 12. We're going to divide that by 5,280. And I end up with 0.621. Now, 0.621 what? 0.621 miles equals 1 kilometer. That's actually the answer to this question over here. But what if I want the answer to the question above it? Flip it over. Do 1 divided by 0.621. So basically, I'm dividing both sides by 0.621. So now take 1, divide it by 0.621. And that gives me the other version. So if I take 1 over 0.621, what that tells me is that there's 1.61 kilometers in 1 mile. More likely, if you were looking for these two conversions, you would look them up somewhere, that if 1 kilometer is about 0.621 miles and 1.61 kilometers is equal to 1 mile. But part of my point in here is that you could actually work through this with students, or you could work through it with yourself, and the only thing that you knew was that an inch was 2.54 centimeters. That is the one conversion that you had that allowed you to set it up between the two of them. Once you know that, and you know the powers of 10 that relate miles and kilometers and centimeters, you can figure out how they're related. So take a look at this before we wrap up part 1 here. Which is bigger? Is a mile bigger or is a kilometer bigger? Well, 1 kilometer only covers 6/10 of a mile. So if you want to cover an entire mile, you're going to need 1.6 kilometers. So it's kind of interesting to go back and forth between the two of these. And on the same way, if you look at your speedometer, sometimes you have miles per hour and then you have a second bar underneath that gives you kilometers per hour. Those kilometers per hour are a little faster than those miles per hour. All right, so this wraps up part 1 of 14.1. I'll do another one with the perimeter and the triangle inequality